Welcome to our first lesson in Biology, BSC 2010. In this lesson, we will be looking at the first part of Chapter 1, an introduction to biology. Biology is the study of life, and life can be pretty complex. As shown here in this diagram, we can study life from the simplest component, which are the atoms, to the broadest and most encompassing level, the biosphere. If we draw our attention to the far right, the atoms, these are the particles of matter that come together to make up molecules. Now, not all molecules are comprising living things. In fact, all things, both living and non-living, are made of atoms and molecules, perhaps, if it's more complex than an atom. But it's the next level that differentiates the living thing from the non-living thing, and that is the cell. Only living things have cells. Now, here it also can get a little complex because some living things are one cell, but others are made of many cells. And this is a topic that we'll get into deeper in this class, where we study the cell and compare and contrast prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells, different kinds of eukaryotic cells, including plant and animal cells. So in today's lesson, we're just kind of skimming the surface of these topics that we'll dig into a lot deeper later in the semester. We will go beyond the level of the cell, though, because in many organisms that are multicelled, the cells come together to perform a specific function, and that is the definition of the tissues. Beyond the tissue level are the organs, which are groups of tissues working together to perform a specific function. And beyond the organs are organ systems, which are comprised of not just one organ, but multiple organs working together to perform a specific function in a living body. For example, in the human body, one of our organ systems would be the circulatory system. We have several organs that are all playing a role in the circulatory system, and if you take one of them out, then the system might not work properly. For example, the heart, which pumps the blood, and then you have the arteries and veins, to name a few. And of course, we need oxygen in our blood to sustain the body. So there's also some interrelationships between the circulatory system and other systems like the respiratory system. All of these organ systems operate to allow an organism to survive. So that brings us to our next level of organization of the organism, a single living creature. It could be, it could be an animal, it could be a plant, it could be a fungus, it could be a protist, it could be bacteria. Any single living thing is an organism. Beyond the level of the organism, like for example shown here, we have a tree in a forest. All of the trees of that same species in that forest would comprise the population. Now, it is important to note that the population has to be in the same general area over the same general time scale, so they're interacting in some way, such as through reproduction, competition, etc. That is the biological definition of a population. Zooming out a bit more, in that forest, you can see it's not just made of trees. In fact, there's some bears here climbing in the tree. So all of the living populations within a defined area, interacting through various means, would comprise the community. So we're talking about like the trees of all the different species, all the animals, all the bacteria, all the fungus. Those are all the community. Zooming out beyond the community, now we're going to include also the non-living things, the air that they're breathing, the soil that the plants are growing out of, the water that the bears drink, even the precipitation that happens in that forest. These all living and non-living factors interacting make up an ecosystem. Now, Earth has many different kinds of ecosystems. For example, like shown here, a deciduous forest. There's also deserts, tropical rainforests, tundra. These are examples of specific ecosystems that collectively make up our biosphere, the living Earth, and all of its living components and how they interact with their non-living surroundings. So one of the reasons we start with this is because it's important to understand that biology is complicated and there's a lot to know. And so sometimes scientists pick one small little piece of the bigger puzzle to study. For example, myself, I was an ecologist. I studied coral reef ecology when I was working on my dissertation research. So the best place to put me on this where I would be the ecosystem level. But some people are cell biologists and they study cells or specific kinds of cells. So there's many different ways to study biology and try to gain knowledge and then fit that into the bigger picture. Okay, pen, turn off. All right. So along those lines of the fact that it's really unrealistic for a biologist to study the entire biosphere, know everything there is to know about the living world. So in order to make things a little bit more manageable, they sometimes focus on simpler components. This is the principle known as reductionism. When you're looking at a small piece of the larger puzzle. One example of how reductionism is used in biology is through model organisms. The animal shown here is a fruit fly. Its scientific name is Drosophila melanogaster, and the fruit fly is a model organism for human research, if you can believe it or not. In fact, there's a lab at FAU where I was in grad school studying fruit flies and human nervous system. If I recall correctly, one of the researchers was looking at how people who suffer from near drownings can survive and potentially not suffer from catastrophic brain damage after being deprived of oxygen. So they're using the fruit fly because fruit fly actually has a very simple brain. They have an optic nerve that gathers information from their eyes and sends it to a brain. So they study that optic nerve path and try to gain information about how it operates in their studies and apply that to some human health and medicine things. We will look at the fruit flies later in terms of genetics because they're also a model organism for looking at inherited traits like their eye color. The eyes are so big and kind of stand out. Eye color is one of the inherited traits, as well as their wing length. To complement reductionism is systems biology. In systems biology, we look at the interrelationships or interactions between different levels of organization to have a better understanding of how a system works by looking at kind of like all the little working parts within that system. And, sometimes the system depends on all of those parts working and the interaction of them together. So, for example, here we have the human body. a system. And the things that happen within the human body are controlled by genes, the DNA code. Those genes encode for molecules like proteins that form these networks of communication and gene regulation. And they code for the different cells and tissues and organ systems that all interact so that a person can survive. So if one of these levels wasn't working properly, like if there was an error with the DNA, a mutation, for example, it could affect the entire way that the system works. So understanding that as a biologist or as a student studying biology, there's a lot to know. So we can try to simplify things, but ultimately the purpose of understanding those simple facts is to see the bigger picture and how those all interconnect to allow a larger process or system to function. So it is complicated. The human body is not a simple thing. Having trouble with the progression of the slide. Got it. Okay. And furthermore, as we look at those levels of organization from simplest to most complex, there's this emergence of new properties that come about just because of the inherent nature of those interactions and more complex phenomena occurring. We'll look at this through some examples. So these emergent properties result from the arrangements and interaction of the parts within a system. I found some examples that are different from your book. I always like to try to bring in some outside resources so you have even more to go off of and find application to what we're talking about in class. So this is from pbs.org. You're welcome to go to that website and poke around and check out the interactive. I've just included a few in the next slides that were most relevant to biology. The first one is how a flock of birds behaves. This is a wonderful example of an emergent property because each individual bird would not have the behavior that the flock has without depending on the other individuals in that flock. So you have here the level of organization of individual organism, right? Each bird. And then the interaction of those individuals, the whole population, you see these new properties, such as the way the flock moves when it's being pursued by a predator. And let's say, for example, one of the birds does get picked off by the predator. That doesn't mean that the entire flock is going to die. Just that one individual will. The flock will continue to exist and perhaps adapt to that occasion. Another example of an emergent property can be seen with ant colonies. Ants have pretty interesting behaviors. I love watching ants, just trying to figure out what are they up to. They have a very strong sense of chemical detection. They use pheromones to communicate with each other. So as a whole, the colony exhibits some really interesting behaviors, foraging for food, moving to different locations for their nest to protect the eggs and the queen. So they can really react to changes in their environment. And an individual ant doesn't live very long. They might even only live for a few days, perhaps months. But the colony survives for years because they have learned to communicate with each other in ways that allows the colony to exist, even beyond the lifetime of an ant. So those examples of emergent properties you can read more about at the pbs.org site. You could see a few other examples, both related to biology and also non-biological topics. So thinking back to the levels of organization, we've seen how it's a way of trying to simplify how we can study biology. We've seen now how the interaction of those different levels can lead to new properties. And there's another thing that we can observe in biology as we look at those levels of organization, and that's an interesting correlation between structure and function. This picture here is a transmission electron micrograph, or a picture taken with a transmission electron microscope of a mitochondria, which is the organelle within a cell that makes ATP, or you might remember it from maybe a basic bio class as the powerhouse of the cell. It makes ATP, which is the unit of energy for a cell. So we're looking at like a slice through it, a cross section. And what I want to draw your attention to are all these inner membranes, the dark lines that kind of look like noodles inside the mitochondria. So these are the inner membranes in the mitochondria, also known as cristae, and this is where the ATP is synthesized. So why do some mitochondria have more inner membrane foldings compared to others? Well, it would have to do with the job of that cell. How much is it dependent on for making ATP? Not all mitochondria are going to look like this. So this is a great example of how the structure of the mitochondria, the amount of infoldings, relates to its ability to produce ATP. We'll study mitochondria and cellular respiration later in the semester. So again, we're looking at this as an example of just a principle that kind of we see throughout the course of the relationship between form and function. Okay, and with that, we're going to conclude our first part of Chapter 1, and the next lesson will be on the remainder of Chapter 1 related to the scientific process.